Good morning, everybody. How you doing today? I know it's Monday. Always tricky to kind of get motivated to do something on a Monday. You're dealing with the massive amount of stuff in your inbox. You're trying to get a handle on your week. I'm at the AWS Summit in Toronto on Thursday, which is why I moved things rather than doing Tuesday, Thursday stream. I moved it over to here to do Monday, Wednesday. May do something on Friday, but appreciate you jumping in. As I've already commented to Richard in the comments, these are archived, so if you can't catch the whole stream live here, you can watch it on LinkedIn. I posted to my website and YouTube as well. So definitely more content to find. Of course, I'm looking at the link that I put in for my site, and I put in the dev link, not the actual link. So my site is not at localhost. That's a nice little hack. My site is at markn.ca. That being said, maybe we just did a little cross-site reference vulnerability there with the local host. Seriously though, hit me up markn.ca/2019 AWS-reinvent, and you'll get the latest content there. So let me actually just even remove that comment. So there, you can get it down at the bottom. So we're going to talk about Amazon S3 today. This is the oldest of AWS services, the one that kind of kicked it off. S3 and EC2 were the first ones that were launched a little over 13 years ago now. Crazy. Absolutely crazy. It is the one that most people think they understand, yet where a lot of the problems come, but there's a huge amount of power here in Amazon S3. And we're going to talk about that. So what we're going to do is we're going to throw up a little timer. We're going to go to around 10:30 today, so about 26 minutes, 25 and change remaining. As always, we are streaming live to LinkedIn. If you have comments, fire them up on the stream here. I am monitoring it. I've got that flow down pretty reasonably. If you're watching this on the replay later on, leave a comment down below on the YouTube video, and I will read all those or reply to all those, and that helps me set up the content for future streams. So the next stream is going to be on Wednesday, and we're going to talk about two services, Amazon Athena and Amazon QuickSight, which actually link to S3. Really powerful, really cool stuff. But today we're going to talk about S3. So let's flip over to the screen here. There we go. Let me get that one browser window open. Always resize it to make it a little easier for y'all to see it. Okay, so I'm going to move myself over in the stream so that you don't have to worry about me. Get my timer over here. We're going to make this a little bit smaller, I think. Cool. All right, there we go. So we're all set. Amazon S3, the three S's very simply for simple storage service, right? Everyone just calls it S3. Everybody knows what it is. It is a storage system. Basically, it's a big directory up in the sky. Very, very simply put, very easy to understand. In this case, actually, if we flip over, I'll go to my website just for a second because I know this is here. If we're looking in the shared responsibility model, which we did a whole stream on last week, S3 fits very firmly in this SaaS or abstract level service, which means we are responsible for the data that we put into it and configuring the service. And that's what we're going to touch on today. You may think this is really basic stuff, and a lot of it is, but that's the whole point of this stream, of this build up to reInvent, is cover some of the basics, cover some of the complicated stuff, and we're going to open your eyes, I think, to a few things in S3, and maybe you'll understand some of the challenges around it, because S3 has unfortunately gotten famous by the number of data breaches that happen to people who are storing data in S3. Now, that's not S3's fault. That's just people failing to understand this model and failing to understand how S3 actually works. Misconfiguration is the number one cloud threat by far, because we have an insane amount of power, right? If we look at all of the services available to us. So this is the AWS console. You can see all of these services. Now, how are you as an individual builder supposed to understand all of the ins and outs of all these services, right? It's really, really difficult because there's so much power at our fingertips. Part of the reason why we're doing this stream. We're going to talk about that. So let's dive right into this. I am going to show you a high level picture real quick there we go. So there are 3 things we need to worry about. We're going to deal with 2 right off the bat, but I want to introduce this concept as we move forward. And again, if you have questions, fire them off here on the LinkedIn stream, and we will address them as we go. So you can see on the screen, we've got a slide up. Very, very simply in Amazon S3, we're going to worry about 3 objects today. The first is literally an object. In common parlance, this is a file. The name of that file is called a key, okay? We also have a bucket. The bucket is where you put everything in. So in S3, the first thing you do is you create a bucket, and then you just start piling objects in there. If you want, you can use a bucket policy, which defines who can shove things into that bucket and who can take things out of that bucket. But right now we're going to start with just the basics. We have objects and we have a bucket. So let's flip back over to our browser. And we are going to actually create a new bucket. Now we did this actually really quick in our first stream on Lambda. We're going to redo it now. So if I click new bucket, now we're going to get the wizard to help us through this. And the first thing we need to do is give it a bucket name. This is the name of the bucket. This is the way we're going to be able to refer to it in sort of common parlance. Then we need to pick the region. Now you'll notice, almost all the regions are available. Hong Kong is disabled because I'm not in China. Same with Bahrain. I haven't turned that on yet. But I can pick, in this case, I'm going to pick East, US East 1, North Virginia. You'll notice I don't have to pick the availability zone. There's the concept of regions, right? US East 1, US West 1, West 2, Canada. These are regions. In the regions, there are availability zones. We do not need to pick an availability zone for S3 because S3 spans all of the availability zones in a given region. That's a really nice thing for durability. We're going to talk about that in a few seconds. So here I can copy settings from an existing bucket. I'm not going to do that because I want to walk you guys through how these settings are set. But we first name Road to Reinvent's the name of our bucket. We're going to leave that in US East. Now, configure options. We want to keep all versions of the objects in the same bucket. No. You can. So S3 has a versioning system, which means if you put sample.txt in and then you update it and upload sample.txt again, you can save successive versions, which is really handy to roll back. So think like iCloud Drive, Dropbox, Box.net. They all have versioning built in. Extremely handy depending on the kind of data that you're dealing with. For us, we're not going to turn that on because we don't want it. Same with logging requests. So you can log all the requests to your bucket. This logs all the gets and the pullets and everything, the activity on your bucket. That can be handy, especially if you're running a website out of your bucket. In our case, we don't want to. Tags, common feature in AWS. Maybe we'll tackle that in a future stream. But tags basically let you put on identifiers, keys, and values to make sure that you make sense of the resources in your own. So if you're in a big company and you're in a shared account, you could say key is team, and then the value is, Mark. Right, so we know Mark's team has this bucket. In our case, we're not going to worry about it. And then you have a finer grained object level logging. So the S3 server access logging up top is sort of chunky. It's really coarse. Down here, you've got some really granular logging. It fills up your logs really quick if you have an active bucket, but you've got that option. And then you can also a checkbox for automatically encrypting your data when it's stored in S3. Now this uses a server-side key, which means you do not manage the key. That's still solid. It still adds an additional layer of protection if you want, and it's really as easy as just checking that box. Now we click next. Gets us to set our permissions. Now we're going to spend quite a bit of time on permissions here. If you guys have questions on permissions, let me know in the chat here on LinkedIn or after the fact in the YouTube chat down below. But very simply, this screen is one of my all-time favorites. And the reason being is that S3 is commonly misconfigured and people end up leaking a bunch of data out of it. Chris Vickery at UpGuard, fantastic researcher Chris is, he has made his lunch on S3 bucket misconfigurations for the last few years. In fact, I've actually written a few articles over on the A Cloud Guru blog around S3 security, simply because people seem to have a challenge with this, right? Very simply S3 buckets start lockdown. Your explicit choices open them up. Okay, so I've written this this article, which actually I'll put the link to in the comments right now. S3 security post. And then there's actually another S3 security post that I've written that's a little bit more detailed. Second S3 security post, typing that in here for you all in the LinkedIn comments. So you've got those links if you want to see them. This one, I think, summarizes it nicely. Too long, didn't read? Just put everything in your bucket and don't make them public. How do you not make them public? Let's flip back to the console. You can see here, this is a relatively new screen. It's been in place for about 18 months. One easy click. Block all public access. Done. Block all public access. Here's my number one tip, my top tip, I guess. I give out lots of tips. Here's my top tip when it comes to S3 buckets. If you're going to have public S3 buckets, try to keep them in a completely separate account. You do not pay for AWS accounts, you pay for AWS account activity. So setting up a whole separate account for public buckets is not going to cost you anything. Now you can create complicated permissions that allow you to write from one account into the other, but not read, which is even better. But you could have that sort of separation, that firewall of going, okay, here's the line, everything on this side of the line is private, everything out in this account is public. That's a really easy way to make sure you kind of don't shoot yourself in the foot. Here's another way is when you're setting up your bucket, block all public access. Until this is unchecked through a specific API call or coming into the console to remove this, nothing in this bucket can be public. That's great. That's what we want. We're going to override everything else with an explicit block. Now, underneath here, there's a ton of options, right? So you can say block public access to the buckets for anything through new lists. So keep existing, but don't add any new. Don't let any control list do it. Block public access through new public bucket policies, blah, 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 blah. Easy said. 9 times out of 10, you just want to leave this checked. Block all public access. Done. We're going to do that because we're not making a website. We're going to block public access. We're going to click next. Now we can go even finer and set, this is the review. Now we're going to see, okay, road to reinvent, US East. We've disabled versioning, logging's disabled. We didn't add any tags. We've got server-side encryption on, and we're blocking all public access. Done. Click create the bucket. You'll see real quick, we've created a bucket. Okay, so now we have our bucket in place. If we click there, we are going to come into the bucket and you'll see we have nothing in our bucket. We have yet to put an object into the bucket. We can do that by clicking on the upload button. This is going to go to the upload dialog. In this case, we're going to add a file. We're going to go to our desktop and we are going to add this file in, which is just a simple image file. It gives us a nice little summary. We can add a bunch of files here to do a group upload. You can't go bigger than 160 gig in one upload through the web browser. You have to use another tool to do that. Not many people are going to hit that limit, but a lot of the time you're not using the web interface to access S3 anyway. So we click next, and here we go to setting permissions. Now permissions, again, we've already set our bucket permissions saying don't let anything be public. Now we can have individual permissions within our objects. So we can say, in this case, I'm logged in with the AWS account for an account called AWS for this demo account, and it has read permissions as well as read and write permissions on this specific object. So it can read all objects and it can read and write those. I could add more users here. I could add another account. You could say, okay, Joe's allowed to access this. Francine's allowed to access this. You could create quite a nuanced set of permissions for this specific file. Now, the way that works is we already have 2 layers in place. We've got our bucket policy up top as a bigger filter, and then the object policy. You've got to pass through the bucket policy to ever hit the object. So if you're blocked at the bucket and allowed at the object, yeah, it's going to conflict. Denies always beat allows. So you want to make sure that they've got that sort of filtering through. Now we click next, and we pick our tier. Now for tiers, you are going to allow... So just to real clarify, because that was going in my head. When you have the bucket policy and the object policy, in our bucket policy, we've said no public access. So that's going to deny any unauthenticated user. So anybody who hasn't logged in won't be able to access it. and then down to the object level where we say Francine and Joe and Mark can access this object. So an authenticated user, let's say Fred, gets through that bucket policy because he's not a public user. He's authenticated. We know who he is. And then he goes to the object policy and doesn't have permission, so he's not allowed. Now, if we said nobody but Fred is allowed to come through this bucket policy, explicitly denying everybody, that would stop everybody else, right? So there's a little bit of nuance there, but you get the point. Bucket policy first, and then the object policy. But now we need to pick our storage class. Now this has a direct impact on your bill. So standard tier is the most expensive. Actually, I think intelligent tiering may be a little bit more expensive now to start. But the idea here is basically how often are you using this stuff? How much durability do you need? So for standard, that's normal standard S3. It goes across 3 availability zones. There's a huge amount of redundancy. I'm just going to flip over to the actual detail here. So if we look at general purpose S3 standard, 11 nines of durability, which means it's highly unlikely that your object will be changed or anything flipped as far as bits go. Resilient against the entire AZ going down because you're across multiple availability zones. Availability, that means your ability to get it back, 4 nines, which is pretty solid, right? That is the standard way that you get storage in S3, and you can go sort of reduce your access from there. So one zone IA is going to give you, only into one zone instead of 3. You're going to keep it for at least 30 days. Glacier goes to cold storage, and Glacier Deep Archive is even colder storage. Intelligent tiering is a new level of storage. It is an intelligent model where it basically says, I'm going to start in standard, and then if you don't use this object, like if nobody's accessing it, I'm going to put it down to less frequent access, and if nobody's using it, then I'm going to push it to Glacier, and if still nobody's using it, I'm going to push it to Deep Archive, because as you go down this chart, it's less money to store. So Glacier and Deep Archive Glacier are really inexpensive to store. They cost a ton of money to pull out, though. So the idea is for long-term stuff that you have to legally keep, but you probably don't want to access daily, Glacier and Deep Archive are great. For stuff you don't really care about, the one zone IA makes a lot of sense. Most of the time, you're going to just sit in standard. The costs are not that big, so it's it's a fraction of pennies and things like that. So we're going to keep it in standard. We're going to hit upload or next, and then we go to our review. That's good, and we upload it, and all of a sudden, we have a file in S3. It's called an object. You'll notice that it is sitting right now in just the root of that bucket. Really interesting thing is that there is no directory structure in S3, even though there's literally a button that calls create folder. The reason being is that this object has a name. That name is called the key. So if you look at this, the key for our file right now is the file name, right? ACG, it's an ad for the course I did on mastering the well-architected framework, or at least this is a screenshot. And you'll see we have a URL. If I hit this URL right now, access denied. Why is the access denied? Because I'm not authenticated on this URL. I'm authenticated in the console. I'm not in the URL. We've blocked all public access. But if we hadn't blocked all public access, you can actually give out URLs for your S3 objects. So in this case, the key here, if we come back to our key point, pun intended, ouch. There are no file folders, but if I create a file folder, let's call this test, and then save it, and now I'm going to upload the exact same file. I'm just going to breeze through this because we've already talked about it. I'm going through the same dialog. I'm keeping all the default settings, blah, 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 and this is now uploaded. Now if I click on this file, you're going to see the key has changed. The file name's still the same. I literally uploaded the same file. I didn't change anything. But the key is now test/file name. And that's because their file folders are a lie. File folders are a lie in S3. They are a way that clients have de facto visualized, the de facto way to visualize files to make it easier to understand. So if we come back to the root of our bucket, you're going to see we still have a folder, and then we have the file in the root, and we have a file in the folder. The reason this is set up in the keys is that anytime the keys start with the same prefix and a slash, it just makes more sense for us to be able to manage it. But an interesting little bit of S3 trivia, there are no file folders. It's all a giant lie. So if we click back to our key, you'll see that we've got the high level information. So when it was modified, the storage class it's currently sitting in, which is standard, its size, its name. We can also adjust some of the properties here. So we can change the storage class. We can add metadata to it. So if we want to do key value pairs and add additional information to these files, that's handy for automation. We can also lock this object so that nobody can delete it. And we can add more tags to it as well. Of course, we can then go to permissions. This will allow us to add complicated permissions. You can see here right now, these are the access object for our owner, which is me. We can add public access, even though it says we can't right now because we've been blocked, which is great. So anything we add under here doesn't apply because we've blocked it, but we can add other accounts, we can add other users, or we can pull records out of S3. But that's really simply put how S3 works. Very easy. Object in a object which has a key, which is the name, into a bucket. Now I'm going to flip you back to the slides for a minute because I want to talk in depth about permissions. So we know we have an object, we know we have a bucket, we know we have a bucket policy. We've seen a little bit about the bucket policy. And again, if you guys have questions, just fire them off in the LinkedIn comments. I am monitoring those actively. So, and I expect some questions on this part because it gets kind of weird. So we saw a bit of the bucket policy already, which is when you have a bucket you create, you can say no public. Don't let anything in this be public. And while we saw that in a nice little dialogue, what was actually happening behind the scenes was the console created a bucket policy for us. And that bucket policy said no public. You can edit that bucket policy and say public with the following exceptions. You could remove the public blocker altogether. You can define how this bucket is used. That's the idea of a bucket policy. You're taking a set of permissions and you're applying it to the bucket itself. And that can say, check to make sure I know who's accessing me. That can say, everybody's allowed to look at this image file, but not this image file. There's a rather complex set of things that you can do. Makes sense. Now, this was the original way to do policies and permissions in S3 because the newer way didn't exist. So bucket policies apply to the bucket, and then anything that goes in the bucket can have additional object policies on top of it. The other way, primary way, to apply permissions in S3 is using AWS IAM, the Identity and Access Management tool. So that allows you to assign permissions to users or to roles. So I am a user, Mark is a user. A role goes to an object, so to a EC2 server or an instance is the parlance in AWS, or to a container somewhere, or to a Lambda function. Roles get assigned to things, okay? So you can think of the bucket policy as really a role assigned to that bucket, but it's managed on its own, and that's the problem. That's where people get messed up. Really, a bucket policy is just a permanent IAM role assigned to that bucket, but it's managed in the S3 area of AWS. All your other permissions are managed in AWS IAM. And this is where you could say, you know what, Mark's allowed to access this bucket, but only objects that fall under the test folder, right? So anything with the prefix test / Mark's allowed to access that. You can do that fine-grained stuff assigned to the person or the role in IAM. And that's really where you should be assigning the vast majority of your permissions. Stick to one place. Don't do both. Both ends up being confusing. Do one. Now, it's Monday. I want to melt your brain a bit because why not? Brains are for melting. That's what we're going to go with for Monday morning. There are two more additional ways to actually apply permissions in AWS. And I'm coming back to the How to Secure an S3 Bucket article I wrote a while ago. So we talked about IAM policies, we talked about bucket policies. There's also a thing called an access control list that gets applied, and query string authentication or URL-based access. So you can give somebody a URL and say, you can post to this URL or you can get from this URL, and it actually goes directly into S3. There are scenarios where you want to use that. However, I strongly recommend that you keep your access all in IAM. Just do it. It's easier, simpler. That's what IAM's there for. It's there for keeping all of your permissions in one place. Gives you a lot of great tools. There's a lot of great ways to audit it, check your permissions. Try to keep them in IAM as much as possible. If you have to, go to the bucket. Because remember, the bucket, think of the bucket policy as a role in IAM assigned to the bucket permanently. That's fine. That works too. Try to avoid access control lists. Try to avoid query string and URL-based stuff because you're just going to get lost. And if you have to, create a new account or new buckets and try not to mix these various ways on the same bucket, because there is no simple way to view all of the permissions assigned to a bucket and everything in that bucket. Okay, that's why, we talked at the start why misconfigurations are the number one problem. That's why. There's too many options. Now, those options, trust me, there are times when one of these will save your butt. And when you're in that scenario, you really want that option. But do not mix and match. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. It's a good rule for life in general. But try to separate these by bucket, if not by account. And again, that public thing, super critical to go by account just to save your you-know-what. So that in a nutshell is S3. Now, I've got 2 minutes left. I wanted to cover something really, really simply. So you'll notice my website here. We're looking at markn.ca. And this is the page I'm tracking all the stuff we're doing around reInvent. So you see here, hey, next stream is right now. That's what we're doing today. And then on Wednesday, we're doing 10 a.m. We're going to talk about Athena and QuickSight. And I posted all the stuff we've talked about already, right? Now, this is actually being served out of an S3 bucket. S3 is a full web server. Super cool. What we're going to do is flip back to S3 here, and we're going to create road to reinvent.com. Now we're going to click next. We're going to leave all of the bucket options as is. We are then going to set permissions. We're going to remove blocking public access, and we're going to create this bucket. Now, the reason being, and the reason why we called this .com is because you can actually assign your bucket to be line up with a domain name. Okay. Now we're clicked on the properties of the bucket. We're going to go to static web hosting, and we are going to say use this bucket to host a website. Index.html is our default. Error.html. There's a bunch of options here for setting up your website. We're simply going to click save. Then we're going to go back to the core of this bucket, and we're going to upload a file. We're going to upload that exact same file that we've uploaded time and time again. When we get to the permissions, what we are going to do is leave that. We'll do it in a second. Standard upload. I'm just looking at the time here. Yay, it's been uploaded. So if we go now and check, you'll see the URL's different. That's fine. But if we click on the URL, we still have access denied. Just because the bucket is set to host a website doesn't mean that's going to work. So what we need to actually do is go to permissions. Everybody can read this object. Big warning. Hey, this is public. Again, don't do this in the same account. Create a second account to do it. We have a dummy demo account that we're looking at today. But now that we've assigned this to be public, if we just refresh this, we should see that everyone has the read access again. If we come back to our URL, there we go. Now this URL, s3.amazon.com/name of our bucket /name, the key name, gives us access to this picture. Okay. You can set up an entire website there. That's in fact what I've done with my personal website, markn.ca. That's in its own separate account being hosted so that I don't make the mistake of doing something like my personal photo archive being exposed. But S3 has the ability to serve websites directly. Of course, you want to make them faster. You can put something like CloudFront in front of them. But that in a nutshell, we are at our time block here. Let me switch back to me. That in a nutshell is S3. You have buckets, you have objects. You put an object in a bucket. You have multiple ways of setting permissions. Stick to one of them if you can. Stick to either IAM permissions for everything or bucket policy for everything. If you need to have a private bucket or a public bucket, put it in a different account. Accounts cost you nothing, usage costs you. So you're not going to pay any more to put it in a separate account. You're going to pay the exact same thing. So that's a good strategy operationally, so you don't kind of shoot yourself in the foot by putting something sensitive into a bucket that's configured for public, because we've seen that time and time and time again over the last few years where people have made a simple mistake taking a bucket that starts locked down and unfortunately adding additional permissions because of the different ways to add permissions. They get tripped up and they expose customer records or sensitive data, and that is bad. It's a very bad thing. This has been a quick introduction into S3. We're going to build on this on Wednesday by looking at Athena and looking at QuickSight. These are tools that help you access the data in S3 or visualize the data in S3. Really cool kind of hidden services. Two of my favorites, actually, that are often overlooked and shouldn't be. So let me know what you think in the comments below. Thanks for joining the stream. The next one, as you saw, is on Wednesday at 10 a.m. Eastern. Again, normally I don't do Monday. Monday's kind of hard, but because I'm at the AWS Summit in Toronto on Thursday, it made sense to do this here. So hit me up, let me know. Thanks for joining the stream. Really appreciate it. Have a great day, and we will talk to you soon.